All right, folks, first podcast of the new year. Here in January 2023, we will recap a couple things that happened in December of last year. We'll zoom out and do a year in review through the lens of CMMC rulemaking, because here in January, there have been a couple of headlines that have come out speculating about the status of the rulemaking program, and we'll look and see if they are accurate or if they may be a little misleading and or sensational. We talk about Jason's experience going through and successfully passing the CCP exam. We address some listener questions that were submitted at the end of last year. We also go over some details in a presentation about the DoD's estimate about how large the defense industrial base is and how many companies might actually be dealing with CUI. We do a deep dive into the rulemaking process to explain the possible scenarios of how rulemaking will play out in 2023 and into 2024. And we also go into an explanation of a research report that was released at the end of 2022 that documents the status and implementation rates of defense contractors dealing with NIST SP 800-171 requirements and DFARS 7012. We wrap up the episode with some bold predictions about what we would hope to see and or think we will see by this time next year. So let us know what you think about our predictions and or our analysis or how last year was going, if we missed anything or what we got right, what we got wrong. Like and subscribe. Thanks a lot. We're kicking off the new year by reviewing the last month of last year. So, I think what normally the concept is that we sort of sum up what happened in the last month. But there's been a couple things, I think, that have bubbled up to people's attention early in January. So we can talk about what happened in December and talk about kind of what's going on in January and then see how it goes. We haven't had a podcast episode at the beginning of the year yet, so we'll just have to kind of play it by feel, right?
Right.
So, yeah, man. But anyways, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to kick off with on the YouTube episode for episode 4, we actually had somebody submit a question. So user Flies on a Wall asked, is it clear today whether 5-point controls can have POAMs or not, or are they must pass without a POAM? So can they be put on a POAM? Is there a determination that has already happened or is forecasted to happen to define the 5 and 3-point controls? Also, if or how the DoD will use scores in the source selection process when competing for contracts. If it's not determined today and planned, is there an ETA? So it's really like 3 questions in one question, right?
Yeah, I was surprised you didn't take a breath there. It definitely pieced a few together. There is some definitive answers to some of these parts of the question, some of the elements of the question, and some of them I'm going to defer to you on. But when it comes down to it, actually, I just completed my CCP training, and this is a foundational piece of the CCP training, the breakdown of the framework and the DoD assessment methodology and the scoring that is associated with it. And then picking which one of these can be put on limited deficiency, right? So short-term remediation, the 90 days or the 180-day POAM that's attached to your assessment.
And just to clarify, the POAM, POA&M, is an acronym that stands for Plan of Action and Milestones. The verbiage that CMMC uses is a limited deficiency time or limited deficiency plan, limited deficiency items, I think is the language that they use. POAM, limited deficiency, basically things you haven't fully implemented and you have a plan for implementing. So the question is that of the requirements that are weighted at 5 points or 3 points, under the DoD assessment methodology weighting system, will the 5-point controls be allowed to be put on a plan for implementation, or do you have to have them all implemented? No plans for implementation allowed.
And so the answer to that is if it's 5 points, with the exception of one control, it cannot be placed on the plan of action and milestone.
Right.
It is a assessment stopper, so to say. Apparently, or not apparently, but according to the assessment methodology that's being used in the CMMC Certified Assessment Process Guide, certified CMMC Assessment Process Guide.
Right. You already passed the test. It doesn't matter now.
And inside, yeah, right. I'm already past my threshold. But inside there, it actually lists the controls that can be put on limited deficiency. And for the most part, with the exception of the 1 5-point control, which do you know what it is?
It's isn't it FIPS encryption?
It is.
It's got a little asterisk next to it where if you're using encryption, you get 3 points. If you're using FIPS validated crypto, you get 5 points. And that's really kind of the only wiggle room that you have. If you have any of the other 5-point controls on a POAM, you are not getting a certification under CMMC.
Or if the FIPS validated encryption, the certification for that encryption module is out of date. It's exceeded its expiration date, and it's in the process of recertification. It's one of those limited deficiency things. But for the most part, everything that you see within the DoD assessment methodology and the things that are allowed in the plan of action and milestone report are 1-point controls. So they have 1-point value attached to them, and they're listed out within, I know they're definitely listed out multiple times in my CCP training materials that I had to use.
Well, and so I guess not a better question, but a different way of asking the question is, based off what we know today, what is allowed to be on a POAM? Because famously, under CMMC 1.0, there were no POAMs allowed. You had to have 100% implementation across the board. And one of the big changes under CMMC 2.0 was the allowance and existence of POAMable requirements, requirements that could be put on a plan for remediation under a limited deficiency timeline, right? And according to the CAP and according to everything that we've heard from DoD, only a small sliver of the 1-point controls would be allowed to be placed on a POAM because the 5-point controls and the 3-point controls are not allowed to be on a POAM. And you have to have, according to the current version of the CAP, I think it's 88% implemented, which when you do the math ends up only being a handful of 1-point controls able to be on a plan of action and milestones. Now, the big caveat there that the DoD will always give you is everything will be clarified via rulemaking. So what we take in the CAP, this language around 5 points and 3 points and 1 points and what's allowed to be on a POAM or not, is going to be finally and ultimately sort of clarified via the rulemaking, but it is a very good preview of what's in the rule. It seems, even though the CAP is a draft document, and even though the CAP is published by the AB, it has DoD's fingerprints all over it. And they won't say which parts the DoD wrote and which parts the AB wrote, but it seems very, very specific and very odd that they are so precise about which controls and which percentage of controls are allowed to be on a POAM or not. So your initial reference flies on a wall is look at the draft CAP from the AB and be familiar with what those 5, 3, and 1-point controls are from the DoD assessment methodology process. And that is going to be verified once rulemaking gets through, which we're going to talk about at length here in a little while. So something else that they said, oh, sorry, what's up?
No, that's I actually was going to jump into that also, is that now here's the part where we kind of need your brain, right? The source selection process. And when competing, are these scores which you enter based off the DoD assessment methodology from the user's question, is it going to be used in the selection process for contracts?
Well, so that's also something that's going to be clarified in rulemaking, right? So how stuff plays into source selection or not is part of the program, right? It doesn't have much to do with the requirements. It has part to do with the program. So that is going to be something that we'll see in the language of rulemaking or not. The degree to which compliance and requirements implementation is used as source selection today seems to kind of be all over the map. Official policy seems to be very open-ended. Whether or not particular program managers or contract officers actually care seems to vary pretty widely. So that's going to be something that isn't in the cap that we don't have a reference to that would be clarified by rulemaking. So
okay.
So based off what we know, 5 points, no POAMs. 3 points, no POAMs. 1 points, only some of them can be on a POAM. Read the cap, read the DoD assessment methodology, and wait for the final rule to come out. But you were saying that the controls that can or can't be on a POAM, the way that POAMs work based off the current draft cap, were questions on your CCP exam, which you recently passed. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I think everyone would like to know your thoughts on your experience in the exam.
So these are my filtered thoughts based off the lengthy contract that I had to sign prior to taking the test that said that I wouldn't discuss A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, right? Look, so I am one of the people that has been through the addended RP training after 2.0 came out.
The original RP training and the new RP training, right?
And the Delta, yeah, not the advanced.
Not the advanced one, yeah.
Right.
But the original version of RP and the new and improved version of RP, which I believe we talked about in a previous episode.
Right, RP training 2.0. And so,
sure. Wow, yeah.
Yeah. And so, obviously, there are some distinct differences to what's contained in those in the trainings alone, right? Obviously, one has a test, one doesn't, but the training associated with the CCP way more in depth. There were areas that are similar, but there wasn't a complete breakdown of things like controls and assessment objectives. Like you went in, you knew they existed, but this was more in the CCP training conducted that I went through was conducted by Edwards, and Edwards essentially, the instructors went granular on the assessment objectives and gave like real-time scenarios for you to understand, if how to determine the adequacy and sufficiency of the evidence and how to prove certain controls and things of that nature. And so there was a lot of that, and then a lot of, and I'm not sure if this is included in the advanced training because I haven't taken it, and I don't think I will take it now that I have the CCP. So unless I just want it for giggles, right?
Sure, yeah.
But for the most part, it's way more in depth, and it covers a lot more of the assessment process.
Okay.
That's the best way to put it there. Like more real time scenarios associated with it
This
instead
is the
of
CCP versus RP.
Correct. The CCP is more of a real. Like almost real scenario-esque training and perspective to it, right? Where with the RP training, you had a bunch of study materials and you went through those study materials and then you were testing the study materials. And the questions that were attached to it were more like about the content and not context.
More like a knowledge exam rather than like a situational sort of scenario-based exam.
Memorization and application, that's a good way to separate it.
So how different is the CCP from the original version of RP, and how different is the CCP as of the time of this podcast, January 2023? How different is CCP from the first RP? How different is it from the second RP?
So from the first RP is light years, absolute light years, my guy. Like, they cover some of the same stuff, code of professional conduct and things that are, in that scenario. But again, in the RP training, it was the code of professional conduct says that blank, blank, blank is blank, blank, right? And with the CCP course, it was more like giving you scenarios to evaluate whether or not they were violations of the code of professional conduct.
I see.
Or giving you a scenario and giving you like options as to how to resolve that according to the COPC, which is the code of professional conduct. So it's more, like I said, more applied knowledge instead of memorization. And I think that that's the best way to sum it up. And then when it gets to the Delta RP training, the Delta RP training was simply, everything that I mentioned about the original RP training, the memorization, and then more memorization into the aspects of the control framework, right? And the assessment objectives and control languages and breaking down each individual domain. So that was a good part of the RP. However, once again, if we're talking about thoroughness and depth and more applied knowledge, CCP is 100% light years ahead of it.
Yeah, and I think that I would agree based off of the RP materials that I've seen versus having gone through CCP and having taught CCP, much more in-depth, much more thorough, it's generally around the same material, but they are very, very different in terms of how much what the credentials represent, right? Because like you said, there's an exam that goes with CCP that you have to pass, and it just goes way more in depth than the RP does. However, the rule of thumb, though, is there's going to be a lot more RPs just by the nature of how they're set up. There's going to be a lot more RPs than there will be CCPs. So if people are going to use RP as some sort of a differentiator, which there's multiple things you could use, but if you're going to use RP as a differentiator with people, I would always ask which version of the training they went through. Because if they went through the original RP training and that's their claim to fame, definitely better to have gone through the updated RP training. Better still to have gone through the CCP training. And the big differentiator at all, really, in my opinion, is just how much time is spent analyzing the assessment objectives in the CMMC assessment guide, which are akin to the assessment objectives in 800-171A. All roads lead to the assessment objectives as the ultimate rule of thumb. And as it stands right now, the CCP training and exam represents sort of the best and most thorough treatment of somebody's knowledge of how to apply and understand those assessment objectives within the context of the CMMC assessment process overall.
65% of my CCP training, probably like 65% of the training that I went through for CCP covered things that I never touched in RP training.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a good, might be a place for people to start, but it's definitely interesting perspective for sure. I think that, when I took the CCP beta exam a couple months ago, the thing that just is very distinctive to me about it in comparison to other types of audit or GRC certifications or things like that is the same thing that differentiates NIST standards from most other standards, is that there are a set of assessment procedures that you have to go through in order to verify if the requirements are implemented. So the exam and the training focuses heavily on whether or not you understand those assessment criteria. And if you're hiring somebody to help you, their knowledge of that assessment criteria is really what's going to be the difference maker, because that's really what you're hiring them for, is to understand how those assessment criteria work. So it's definitely good perspective. I mean, as far as 2022 goes overall, I think that the existence of the CCP exams, the existence of the CCA exams, the beta exams, at this time last year, we didn't have any of that stuff. We didn't have the beta exams. We didn't have the real exams. And the difference between last January and this January in terms of the available training and the number of certified CCPs and so on and so forth, pretty much night and day. But there were a lot of things, I think, that happened in the last year. And from my perspective, if we were going to do sort of a short year in review, the context about what's going on with CMMC is always defined. It always lives and dies by what's going on with rulemaking, right? So just this month, just recently, as of the time of this recording, there have been 2 articles that have come out on a relatively well-known media publication that says that CMMC rulemaking is delayed. It is delayed. There is going to be a delay, which I find peculiar and curious. And every time there's a headline that talks about the delay, it's getting curiouser and curiouser, because there's not a lot of information in those articles to explain that there even is a delay or how they reached that conclusion. So let's just maybe talk about what happened last year, and then we'll get to those headlines and see, people can make up their own minds if they think that there is a delay or not. So to zoom all the way out, we spent all of 2021 basically waiting for the DoD to do or say something related to CMMC. And they were going through a large programmatic review of CMMC at the Pentagon level in response to all of the comments that they got on the 2020 rule that came out, right? So they spent like 9 months of 2021 doing this review. And at the end of 2021, they came out with an announcement and they said, ta-da, CMMC 2.0. We listened to what you said. We circled the wagons. We debated internally, and we have come up with a response to those public comments, and we're calling it CMMC 2.0. And there's a bunch of changes that we're making. And the changes were, we're now allowing POA&M'ds. We're now allowing waivers. We're now shifting from 5 levels to 3 levels. We are bifurcating level 2 so that only some people with CUI will need an external assessment and other people will be able to self-assess. CMMC level 1, folks who do not have any CUI at all, will be able to self-assess. They do not need an external assessment, and so on and so forth. There were like half a dozen or so of these features of CMMC 2.0. Those were the changes that they came up with, right? And then they said at the end of 2021, we're going to do rulemaking to codify these changes. And it will take us 9 to 24 months to complete that process, was their estimate. 24 months from November of 2021, right? Stay with me, is November of 2023, right? So 2 years later would be November of 2023. November of this year, as of this recording, would be what was happened. So what happened in 2022? Well, they started going through rulemaking. In parallel to that, the AB is standing up the ecosystem and they're creating the certification exams and everybody's going through training and the cap is coming out and all this stuff happened on the CMMC Cyber AB side of the house. And DoD under the surface is paddling their little duck feet and they're going through rulemaking. There's a bunch of bureaucratic cost and hoops and red tape that you have to go through to do rulemaking, right? It's a big commitment. So then around springtime of last year, springtime of 2022, DoD came out and said, we plan to publish an interim final rule in May of 2023. And that means that when they publish the rule, it is effective basically immediately, right? The public can still comment on it. There's some red tape that they have to go through. Once they publish it, effectively, they can start inserting it into contracts like 60 days later. So in the spring of 2022, they said, we're going to publish in May of 2023. And so by like June, July, we're going to start to see this. Summer of 2023, we're going to start to see this thing start to roll out into contracts. Okay, that's well within this 9 to 24 month window. And then some time goes on, and in early summer, they come out and they say, guess what, everybody? Great news. We are going to publish that interim final rule 2 months earlier than we originally thought. We're going to publish it in March of 2023, which means we may be able to start rolling out CMMC earlier than we originally thought. So if you sort of take those two things together, you're like, all right, we're going to go through 2022, and we're probably going to see a published rule between March and May, and we're probably going to see the rollout start between May and June. So spring, summer, call it, right? Is like a rough estimate. And this is when we sort of sat down and looked at the timeline and we're like, hey, it takes companies longer than the anticipated estimate to get ready for an assessment and go through their digital transformation, their compliance transformation, get all their migrations and configurations and their culture changes. Like, to go through all of this stuff, migrate your workloads, whatever you have to do on average, it generally takes companies about a year. And in the early summer of 2022, the idea that the rule was going to start to roll out in the summer of 2023, you're out of time. Like, we don't have a lot of wiggle room at this point. Right. It was the first time that the timelines had inverted, where the timeline to get ready was shorter than the timeline for when the rule was going to come out. And that's a bad situation. Or sorry, the timeline to get ready is longer than the timeline for the rule to come out. That's a bad situation. So we go along, and the DoD doesn't submit their rule for regulatory review on schedule, right? They said, hey, we're planning to submit it in the summer, but we haven't done it yet. Timeline still hasn't changed. Okay. So we get into the fall, and they say, well, we haven't submitted it to OMB yet, the Office of Management and Budget for Regulatory Review, but we're still on track for publishing this rule. And everybody goes, okay. And based off of what we knew at the time about how long regulatory review takes, they can still easily make this publication window that they had predicted. And they're still well within the 9 to 24 month window that they had predicted back at the end of 2021, right? So even if they're like slipping to the right or left in the overall picture of their estimate, we're still well before November of 2023, right?
Right.
So, we had we had CS2 events that went on. We started the podcast, like we made a lot of content. We started doing all this stuff, and we were letting people know. We were like, hey, this timeline is a problem because it's going to take you longer to get ready than when they're going to publish this rule. Even if they hit May instead of March or April instead of May, like at this point, it doesn't really matter because we know when it's going to get published. And then the holidays come around and the government does what the government does. Everything shuts down and the rule doesn't get submitted for regulatory review. And we're like, well, okay, it's got to be January then. And so now we're looking for publication around March is what they said in early summer. And then these articles come out and the headlines in January, at the end of December and in January say the following. Pentagon's CMMC program launch faces delay as OMB rulemaking shifts to January. And so that is a sensational headline because nowhere has the DoD updated what they told us in the summer. Like nowhere has DoD said that this March-May publication time is in jeopardy. Right? They said they were planning to submit way earlier, but they haven't said that the submission will change when the published rule comes out. So where's the delay coming from?
Right.
And they go, well, maybe OMB rulemaking review is what's going to cause the delay. And so I don't know how everybody else spent their holiday, but I spent my holiday going back through all 328 rulemaking actions that the DoD has undergone since 2009 that have gone to OMB for regulatory review. They list the dates right there on their website if you're willing to click on all of them. The API is not really there, so you had to go manually get all this data. And on average, everybody, these are averages, right? On average, for the amount of time that it takes OMB to review a rule that is submitted by DoD and then subsequently send it to the Federal Register to be published is 66 business days, right? 66 business days. DoD came out in this article in January and said, we're planning to submit the rule to OMB in January. So if they submit the rule for regulatory review to OMB at the end of this month and you add 66 days, we would get a published rule in May. So
May's a safe assumption. So you're thinking January to February, that's 30. February to March, that's another 30. So you're looking into March.
Yeah, and this is on average.
May.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So you're talking. Let's call it May, right? And so you're like, okay, that doesn't sound like a delay to me in terms of when it's going to be published. Right. Because their original estimate in the spring of 2022 was we're publishing in May. They revised it and they said, now we're going to publish in March. So I guess it's a delay because they're back to when they originally thought that they were going to publish. But that doesn't really seem like a headline that says delayed. It's delayed. Right? You're like, that's not, and that's not what the article says, right? So I don't think that is the source of the delay. I mean, I guess you could call it that, but whatever. So it's going to take them 66 business days from the time they submit the rule to OMB for regulatory review. Even if that happens in early February, you're still going to end up in May, right? So they are on track to publish when they said they were going to publish a year ago, right? Now, here's the catch, because earlier this week, another headline came out and it said, Pentagon plans to formally propose changes to CMMC program ahead of official launch. And they said full implementation of the Pentagon's CMMC program will likely shift to 2024 based on revised estimates from the DoD in the fall 2022 unified agenda. There's a bunch of new jargon in that opening line there. And the word that jumped out to me was likely shift to 2024. There is no statement from DoD that says it's likely to shift to 2024. They haven't updated anything about their estimate for publication since the fall, right? We're still in this March-May publication. Now, here's the rulemaking detail for everybody to understand. There are two possible scenarios for what happens once the rule is published. Once the rule is published, once the 66 business day average gets done and then it gets published in the Federal Register,
so before you dig too deep, right? Just to make sure that we clarify and we understand, from the moment that the DoD submits the rule to OMB, 66 days is the average until there's some sort of judgment associated with the rule.
On average, the average amount of time that it takes for OMB to review the rule. So what does that mean, right? There are a ton of, if you think the government is bureaucratic, OMB and rulemaking review, regulatory review, is the center of the bureaucratic reactor. It is the black hole at the center of the bureaucratic universe. No light can escape how much red tape there is in OMB review of rulemaking. Interesting note, that is a very large and time-consuming bureaucratic cost. So for the DoD to have emerged from their review of the program in 2021 and then opted to go through this process again to codify CMMC is a massive signal. It was massive at the time. It still is today. That CMMC is not going away because they're committing resources to reinforcing and codifying this program, right?
Okay.
So there's a bunch of executive order analysis that has to happen. There's a bunch of the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Congressional Review Act. Like, there's all this stuff that has to happen with these long and lengthy reviews that most people don't know happen, and they never actually read the analysis anyways. But you got to go through it because those are the rules for making rules, right?
Right.
So on average, that review process and then sending it to the Federal Register to publish once it's reviewed takes 66 business days. Okay. So end of January, early February, that puts you in May of this year for when it would be published, Now, here's where things get more speculative, because there will be one of two statuses assigned to this rule. It will either be what is known as an interim final rule, or it will be a proposed rule.
Okay.
The only difference between those two things is whether or not the rule becomes effective when it's published, or if the DoD has to take public comment and respond to those comments, and then it becomes effective. That's the only difference. Everybody's going to get to comment on the rule. The only difference is, do you take comments after it's effective, interim final, or do you take comments before, proposed? It's the only difference. Now, DoD wants an interim final rule. Previous cybersecurity rulemaking has all been interim final rules. There's a strong case for getting an interim final rule. Ultimately, we don't know what status it's going to have, whether it's interim final or proposed. The amount of time that it takes for an interim final rule to basically be, no joke, on the books, fully done and ready, 60 days, right?
Okay.
Comment period, some extra minor pieces of red tape. It's basically effective 60 days, which is why in 2021, the DoD said if we publish in March, May, you should start to see it roll out in May to July, because that would be 60 days after the publication period.
Okay.
Problem is that the DoD never explained that there is a second possible scenario here, right? They want the interim rule. They hope that they're going to get an interim rule. They think they're going to get an interim rule. There's a lot of reasons why they could get the interim rule. If the rule is proposed, you have to allow 60 days of public comment, and then you have to go through and adjudicate all of the relevant comments, respond to them, and then publish those responses in a final rule, and then the rule becomes effective. So that takes a lot longer, right? Because you have to go through and do all of this response before the rule becomes effective. So how long does that take? we went back through and looked at all 328 rules that have gone through this process before and looked at just the set of rules that have been published as proposed and then subsequently made final. And depending on how you count the days, because of some weirdness with some of the rules, it is between 305 and 333 business days.
Okay.
There are 260 business days in a normal year. And so if the rule becomes proposed, you basically have a year on average. Big asterisk, big grain of salt here. This covers all kinds of rules that DoD has issued since 2009, right? So there are outliers above and below. This is a game of averages, and every rule is different. But on average, it takes about a year in business days, 305, 330 business days, for a rule to go from proposed, get the comments, respond to the comments, publish a final rule. If you say that they are going to submit in January, February, we get a published rule in May, and it is proposed, and you add 305 to 330 business days, that puts you in summer of 2024, right?
Okay.
So if they get an interim final rule in May, that puts us in summer of 2023. If we get a proposed rule, that puts us in summer of 2024. That's it. That's it. So is it delayed? Well, first of all, we don't know what the status of the rule is. We won't know until it's published. So we don't know if it's delayed. Let's say it is proposed. How much of a delay are we talking about? The original estimate was 9 to 24 months. The tail end of that estimate being November of 2023. So if you end up getting a rule in July of 2024, you've missed your estimate, your multi-year estimate from 2 years ago. You've missed that estimate by like 6 months, which I don't know what planet everyone's living on. But for the government to estimate within 6 months, over the course of many years, the implementation of a complex program, not too shabby, right?
Yeah,
not too shabby.
I have to agree. So I have just a couple questions, right?
Lay them on me.
All right. So my first question, and it's a 3-part question, right? My first question is interim and proposed. What are the pros and cons of each?
Sure. Okay.
And
yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to? You want
Let's
it all
start
at
with
once?
that one. Let's start with that one. All right.
We'll rapid fire it.
So the normal way that rulemaking works is that a agency is going to decide they're going to do rulemaking. They are going to do all of their internal coordination and come up with their rule. They are going to publish it as a proposed rule. They get public comment. They review and adjudicate those public comments. They respond in a published final rule. That is the normal way it goes. Proposed, comments, final rule. That is normal notice and comment rulemaking. That is governed by the Administrative Procedure Act. The reason why that is so important is that rulemaking by government agencies is not a democratic function, right? People who work at agencies aren't elected. They are unelected bureaucrats. And so for them to create a regulation that affects the public without any public input at all is not a democratic function. And we live in a democracy. So we created a law that said you have to involve the public anytime you write a regulation. So that's the way it's supposed to work. That is the way that we maintain democratic order over this ability to create law that doesn't go through Congress, right? So the pro is errors are caught. The public gets to participate. You know what's coming, right? Everybody's on the same page when you go through proposed rulemaking. Okay. If you go way back in the day, the very original DFARS cybersecurity rule that established DFARS 7012 for the first time, that started in 2011, which is when it really first started to pop up, went through notice, comments, responses, final rule. That is how everything started, right? The other option is what's known as an interim final rule, where you don't take comments first. You publish the rule and it becomes effective immediately. And you take comments only after it's on the books, not a democratic function. And there is no obligation that the agencies have to ever respond to those comments or to make changes based off of those substantive comments, because it's already on the books. Now, it's nice if they do, but a lot of rules sort of government-wide that get published as interim final rules never get a corresponding final rule. They just stay interim final forever because they don't have to, right? Like they don't have to. So the advantage with an interim final rule is in situations where health and safety is a concern, in situations where national security is a concern, in like lots of situations where you don't have a year to go through this process, you need to promulgate this regulation immediately. Then if you have what is known as good cause under the Administrative Procedure Act, then you can get a waiver. You can get an acceleration of when this rule comes out. For most people who are familiar with CMMC and DFARS and so on and so forth, they are more familiar with the outputs of interim final rules. The rule that came out in 2016 that revised DFARS 7012 and specified NIST SP 800-171 and said FedRAMP moderate equivalent, all of that stuff that you've heard is the result of an interim final rule.
Okay.
It was an interim final rule because in 2015, the government got spanked when China hacked the Office of Personnel Management and stole all that clearance information, right? So they just scrambled together and they said, well, do stuff. And so the existing rule in the books was DFARS 7012 from 2013. They updated it, they revised it, they slapped in a revised set of requirements from 853 down to 171. They added some FedRAMP stuff when data's in the cloud, blah, blah, blah. Here you go, interim final rule, right? Well, as we know, nobody really knew that happened. Nobody really paid attention. Nobody really made any noise about it. And as a result, requirements went unimplemented for a long time. And it got so bad that after many, many industry reports and ultimately a DoD Inspector General report came out and said, no one has implemented these requirements at all and we're hemorrhaging data, we got another interim final rule that got published in 2020. And that's how we got the DoD Assessment Methodology Program and the CMMC Assessment Program to try to verify that the requirements from 2016, itself an interim final rule, were going to be implemented. So we now have a series of 2 rules that are related to the same requirements that got interim final status. So the 2020 rule received a ton of public comments, like 850 public comments. As far as I can tell, the Federal Register still lists the page view number, the count of how many people have viewed the pages, like an old school 1990s website. And as far as I can tell from going through all these records, the 2020 CMMC rule has more page views than any DoD rule they've ever issued since 2009 by like a massive amount. So there was a lot of public feedback on this rule that is now the law, right? DFARS 7021, DFARS 7020, and DFARS 7019 contract clauses are on the books. They are written to the Code of Federal Regulations. They are the result of an interim final rule. But the DoD said, we're going to take all of 2021, look at these comments, come up with a plan, and then we'll figure out what to do from there. And what we got was CMMC 2.0 and an announcement of more rulemaking, right?
Okay.
Now the question is, will that rule be itself interim final like the 2 before it that it augments, or will it be proposed? The strong case, logically, is that it should be an interim final rule. If the basis for the interim final rule 2 times before is still valid, it's not like cybersecurity's gotten any better. It's not like implementation rates have gotten any better. We talked about the DIBCAC numbers on a previous episode. We're going to talk about a new report that came out last month, coming up in a little while. Nobody's implemented the requirements. We're still losing the data. The threat landscape is way worse. Nothing has changed since the 2016 rule or the 2020 rule. So why would you not have an interim final rule for the 2023 rule that's getting ready to come out?
Okay.
So this is why it's so hard to predict, because could it be a proposed rule? Sure. Are there advantages to being a proposed rule? Definitely. Is there a very strong case for why it should be an interim final rule? Absolutely. Is this the third rule in a string of rules that have been interim final? 100%. So why is there a headline that says the program is delayed? Do they know something that no one else knows? Is the rule published? Is it even submitted for regulatory review yet? It is not a good take on what's currently happening, because rulemaking is weird, man. Like, it's hard to understand. It's very opaque, despite how important it is.
I talk to you about it every day, and I can tell you, look, I'm glad you're around.
It's strange. Yeah, it's strange for sure. But this is the thing where we don't know what's going to happen. I've asked DoD until I am blue in the face, what is the likelihood that it is interim final or proposed? I see the case for both. There's a good case for both. Is there a likelihood? Is it 50-50? Is it 80-20? They'll never say, right? Because they may not even know, right? It's really up to OMB to determine if they get a waiver under the Administrative Procedure Act. But this is an interesting way to look at things, right? Because people are seeing this headline and they go, it's delayed. If a proposed rule is the normal way that rulemaking takes, then the normal timeline is 66 days plus 300 days, right? That's the normal timeline. So the normal timeline puts us in summer of 2024. The waiver under interim final, the ability to subvert democracy and publish your rule immediately, puts it in summer of 2023. So the question should be not, is it delayed, but how likely is it to be accelerated?
Yeah.
Right. Now, what I wish had happened, so before we get to your question, what I wish had happened is when they announced CMMC 2.0 in November of 2021, they said, the rule is happening. We spent all year reviewing it. We read every one of your comments. Here are our changes that we're going to codify via a rule. It takes 9 to 24 months, and one of two things will happen. We will either get a proposed rule the normal way, or we will get an interim final rule, which will have it done a year earlier. We are doing everything we can to get an interim final rule. We want it to be an interim final rule. It should be an interim final rule, and we can make the case to OMB for why that's true. It will either be summer of 2023 or summer of 2024. See you then. We got a bunch of paperwork to do. They only told people the interim final rule timeline. They never told people that proposed rules are a possible thing. So now everyone's finding out what the normal timeline actually has been all along. And they go, well, I told you it's going to be delayed. I told you it's not going to happen, even though everything is functioning exactly the way rulemaking is supposed to.
Okay. So quick rapid fire here. Okay. I'm going to ask you a question. 2 sentences
rapid
or less.
Rapid fire rulemaking is a definite oxymoron.
Oh, yeah. It's a new segment. Just chalk it up. Producer Dustin, put that on the board.
Yeah.
So listen, I want you to answer these questions. I would like to say 2 sentences or less.
Okay, I'll try.
All right. Yeah. Like I understand, dude.
I don't know what these questions are going to be, so we'll see.
All right. So
we'll edit it in post to make it very short.
What status designation is a better outcome for the DIB, for the organizations a part of the DIB? You okay?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, right? So it's a hard question to answer. An interim, man, that is a hard. So let me tell you what the advantages and disadvantages are for both. That's already one sentence. Interim final rule rolls out soon. These are commas, so I'm just going to keep going. Interim final rule, comma, rolls out sooner, comma, right? All right. So interim final rule will roll out sooner. So your need to be able to make it through an assessment will occur sooner. So that's not good if you're not ready, right?
Okay.
However, there's a boogeyman on the horizon that people aren't thinking about, and that is revision 3 of 800-171, which we fully expect will have more requirements in it than NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. So the people who, assuming we get an interim final rule, go through their assessment first will dodge a bullet because they won't have to get an assessment under 800-171 Rev 3 for 3 years.
Right. Like we covered that last month. Yep.
An interim final rule is much better for people who are ready to go, right?
Yeah.
It's not great for people who aren't ready to go because they got to go sooner. So you would think that, on the other hand, a proposed rule is better for people who aren't ready. But that isn't necessarily true, because although you have more time, you have an additional budget cycle for the extra year or so that it takes to get through these comments. It is more likely that you will have to get assessed against SP 800-171 Rev 3. Also, a second order effect of what could happen here is the CMMC ecosystem will probably not grow at the rate that it needs to support all the people who will need to get assessments, because there's another year to go. And so people will delay their training. People will delay getting their C3PAO status. The ecosystem will not do as well. It won't grow as fast as it needs to. That's the main constraint on whether people can get assessments. What that means is that even though you had more time to implement your requirements, if the constraints are bigger by the time the proposed rule is done, it will take you longer and it will be more expensive. So is it worth it? It depends. Are you ready now? Then you definitely want the interim final rule. Even if you aren't ready now, it's probably worth getting in line because it's going to be cheaper in the long run. The proposed rule is good for the DIB because you get more time. You get an unofficial extension on people checking your work that has been due since 2016. But it's probably more expensive in the long run as a result of doing rulemaking the normal way, if you will. So okay. I don't think either one of them is good or bad purely. I think there are some distinct trade-offs for both. One thing to consider, right, is that having been one of the few people, I think, that have gone through and read the public comments on all of the previous rules, they are all very, very, very similar. And they are all usually not about the CMMC program itself. They are about the requirements. Mm-hmm. The CMMC program rule has nothing to do with the requirements at all. So if you're waiting for this public comment period to give the government a piece of your mind about the nature of 800-171, that comment's not relevant. So there's a good chance that the comment responses won't take as long because the DoD is going to be able to copy and paste a lot of comment responses that they had from 2020, 2016, and 2013. Okay. So which one's good? Which one's bad? A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, I guess.
2 sentences, buddy. 2 sentences.
Like I said, Dustin.
There's a lot of comments.
Yeah,
a lot of comments. No, dude. I don't think it needs
a lot of semicolons and a lot of comments. It's fine.
I think it's perfect. I think that trying to limit you to 2 sentences on something like that that's so open-ended is difficult. But here's the next one.
Okay. All right. 2-sentence challenge.
2-sentence challenge. What status designation is better for the program overall, the CMMC program overall?
2 sentences. Same answer. Right? It depends. How about that?
Period. Answer. Period. I didn't say they had to be complete sentences.
Yeah, exactly. They could be fragments. Which one's better for the CMMC program? All right. So going through proposed rule, comments, final rule is better for the program because you are doing things by the book, right? You are going through rulemaking the way it is intended. You are going through and upholding democracy. You are giving the public a chance to comment on a rule before it becomes effective and affects them, right? So that is good for the program. It is less of a target for challenge on a legal basis if it goes through proposed rule rather than an interim final rule. Because if you went through and did everything according to the book, and you went through and did everything and dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's, the public had their chance to make their comment. You did all of your internal coordination. You did all your regulatory review. You didn't ask for any waivers. You didn't ask to go fast. You did everything you're supposed to do, and you got all the receipts. So that's good for the program from an inevitability and how unassailable it is, because there's basically no debate at that point. Mm-hmm. Is it good for the program to have another year before it starts to roll out? That's probably not true, right? Because you have more time to have more assessors, good thing, but you have more people wait to go through the assessor training, bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. So you're probably going to have a mixed bag of what happens to the ecosystem. Like, is it going to collapse and everybody just like goes off and does something else? Probably not, because the amount of time that it takes to get ready is longer than how much time is left, really. But the number of people who hesitate and wait 6 months or 12 months to get started is probably going to increase. And so you're going to have a bunch of pent up demand on the periphery, which is not good for the health of the program, mostly because it ends up being more expensive for everybody on the back end. It takes longer to get everybody through the cycle. So which one is better? Hard to say. There are distinct advantages and disadvantages of both. And what we know based off of DoD's statements over the last year and a half is that they want an interim final rule. And there's a very strong case for why it should be. So
the national security aspect is a strong enough case as it is.
Listen, there's a lot of people who don't agree that it is a national security concern or a proper way of addressing national security. That doesn't really matter, because in the eyes of OMB on previous rulemaking, the basis for an interim final rule good cause exception in the name of national security was valid enough. And so if all this rule is doing is adding teeth to a program that we needed an interim final rule for because it wasn't working, then it would make sense that it would be justified in getting interim final status. Now, the caveat there, just before we jump into the next one, the caveat there is that from what people have been rumored to say, the rule is very complex and it is very long. And so that can be a consideration for why you would go through the proposed method rather than the interim final rule method, if you will, because you're going to need that time to respond to the comments and get everybody's thoughts. The sort of X factor here is the 2020 rule had two parts. CMMC was only one part of the 2020 rule, right? The 2020 rule had two prongs, is what they called it. It had the DoD assessment methodology, the DODAM, and it had CMMC assessment methodology, if you will. Two different prongs, two different programs. We are not waiting on the CMMC program rule for the other DoD assessment methodology prong to finish. It's on the books. It's already happening. People are already getting phone calls from their customers and from the government about their compliance and implementation of 800-171 under those contract clauses. So we saw this at the end of last year. Tons and tons of companies were calling at the end of the year panicking because they had waited on what's happening with CMMC to get started on their implementation with 171 under 7012, 7019, 7020. Their customer calls them and they go, hey, can you show us what's going on with your implementation and your security posture and according to these requirements? And they're like, CMMC's rulemaking is not done yet. And the customer was like, what does that have to do with anything? That has nothing to do with your requirements under 7012 or your assessment requirements and assurance requirements under 19 and 20. So still, right, the biggest misconception is the relationship between the program and the requirements. So even if we get a proposed rule, you're still going to see tons and tons of companies get a brick thrown through their window with a 7019 and 7020 label on it, and they'll be very surprised as to why they're being asked about these requirements when the CMMC rule isn't done yet.
All right. Two quick super rapid fires. One word answer.
One word. All right.
All right. If the rule is either interim final or proposed, does it change the fact that I still have to implement NIST 800-171 principles?
No.
Cool. Next one. Actually, no, we'll stop at one because that actually covered both of them. Okay. I just threw both questions into one. Listen.
Perfect.
Yeah. Off the cuff sometimes.
Yeah. Your obligation to implement 800-171 stems from a rule that created DFARS or that revised DFARS 7012 in 2016. 2016. What's funny is if you go all the way back to the OG rule, right? The one pre 800-171, the proto rule that started it all, that one went final in 2013. It's 2023, right? 10 years of a slow moving wave is finally about to crest when they add the CMMC program rule to it, but it has nothing to do with your obligation to implement the requirements, which probably on a future episode, we can maybe talk about what some of the previous comments have said on the other rules, because I've made the case before. You can predict what the comments on the rule will be by going back and reading the other comments because they address all of the same arguments and issues on on all of the rules. So we already know what the government's answers are going to be. So
awesome.
Yeah. So there you go.
Congratulations for surviving the rapid fire round.
You know what? It was hard, but we made it. We made it. So I think maybe an improvement. Let us know in the comments. Maybe an improvement in the year. Can you do a rapid fire 2-sentence answer in less than 20 sentences in 20 minutes?
No, Jacob cannot actually.
I don't know if I can, but we all have room to improve. So I'll make that a proposed rule instead of an interim final rule. All right. So so right at the end of the year, around the holiday time, our friends at the outstanding Cooey Center of Excellence Discord server had their annual Cooey Christmas event. The Cooey Discord server, for those of you that don't know, is a great community, the nerve center, some would say, of what's going on with all things related to NIST, CMMC, FedRAMP, any type of federal adjacent compliance GRC type work. They are always looking at what's going on, and they do this event at the holidays every year called Cooey Christmas, where it's sort of all kinds of presentations and just sort of like a community B-sides for CMMC and DFARS and NIST, if you will. And so I gave a sort of very casual, sort of open-ended presentation on some interesting data that is contained in the rules that have come out over the last few years related to DFARS cybersecurity requirements. Part of one of the many analyses that they have to do when they go through rulemaking is they have to try and estimate the number of entities that the rule will affect, right? They have to try and estimate specifically the number of entities that it will affect who are small businesses. And that's a very interesting question because every rule that they've come out with, proposed and interim, proposed and final, proposed and blah, 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 has to do the same estimate. Since we're talking about the DIB and you're talking about CUI and you're talking about the same requirements, you would expect that those estimates are the same each time. And as it turns out, they are wildly different from rule to rule over the years, like starkly different. Stunningly, cannot possibly be estimating the same universe of companies different, right? So you had the rule that came out in 2011 and finalized in 2013. Rule came out in 2015, finalized in 2016. And then you had the rule in 2020 that came out, right? That gave us CMMC and everything as we know it today. So if you go all the way back to the rule in 2011, 2013 time, the original first rule, they say, the DoD says that based on their figures, they estimate 6,555 contractors would be handling unclassified controlled technical information and be affected by the rule. You need to implement your cybersecurity requirements. 6,500 contractors. That is not 300,000. Right? All anybody hears when they hear about CMMC is there's 300,000 companies in the DIB. There's 300,000 companies in the DIB. Most recently, when CMMC 2.0 came out, they said, well, we only care about companies that have CUI. And we estimate that is 80,000 companies.
Right.
Whether it's 80,000 or it's 300,000, that's way more than 6,500 that they said in 2011, 2013, right?
Right.
And then they said that of the 6,500 companies that are affected, less than half of them are small businesses. So like less than 3,000 companies are small businesses that would have this data and be affected. That is a wild data point, right? And there's no citation for where they got that number from. There's no citation for where the data is flowing. They just put that number in there. They said 6,500, like half of them are probably small businesses. See you later, right? So big delta between what we know now and what they said back then. 2015, 2016 time comes along, and there's the rule that revised 7012 and points to 171, everybody's favorite. And they said, this rule applies to contractors with covered defense information transiting their information systems, familiar to everybody. DoD estimates that this rule may apply to 10,000 contractors, and less than half of those are small entities. So 2 years before, they said 6,500, less than half are small. 2 years later, they say 10,000 companies and less than half are small. So the data flow expanded, or the number of companies in the DIB that deal with the data expanded to the point where we almost doubled the number of companies that are actually going to be dealing with any of this.
So my question is that even if there was like some sort of expected growth in organizations that deal with the DIB, in this time frame, that growth isn't like one of those exponential growth situations, right? Like, it's not like where we are incrementally growing. Excuse me. This is like an exponential boom, so to say.
Well, this is the thing: is there's still no citation for that rule in 2015 about where these numbers came from, and so it begs the question: where did you get the number from? And
it's quotation marks, and it just says us. Like,
yeah, and it just says
DoD
estimates, right? DoD estimates. But then in 2016, we get their final rule, right? And they have some very interesting explanations for where they got their numbers from. And they say there is no database collecting the number of contractors receiving covered defense information. It is difficult to determine how many contractors are required to implement their security requirements in accordance with 7012. We don't have a database that tells us how many contractors there are. We're just guessing. And then they go on to say it's not possible to determine how many subcontractors are in possession of covered defense information. And we are going to revise the estimate based off public comments, because a bunch of people commented and they said, you're crazy, man. 10,000 companies, there's way more companies that have this information out there. Where are you getting these numbers from? And they go, okay, all right, we're going to revise that number up. We're going up. And they said, we revise it to 12,000 small businesses that are primes or contractors will be required to handle covered defense information during the performance of subcontracted work. However, there is currently no system to track when covered defense information is present on contract or passed to contractors and subcontractors. So this estimate is not made with a high level of certainty and cannot be accurately estimated. We have no idea how many companies are affected. We have no idea who's getting the data. No clue. Interim final rule. See you later, everybody. Right? We heard you. We responded. We listened to you. 12,000 instead of 10,000. Right?
we don't know who you are or how many of you there is, but you got some responsibilities to live up to. So good luck.
We had no idea. So remember, this is 2016. 2016, not all that long ago. Right. As of 2016, they said we don't have a database. We don't have data flow. We don't know where the data is going. We don't know who has it. There is no way for us to estimate. We have no confidence in this estimate. We cannot estimate it. We guessed. 2016. Well, what happens in 2020? 2020, we get a rule. We get an interim final rule that gives us DoD assessment methodology and the CMMC program. And because it's rulemaking, you got to go through the same analyses that you go through regardless of what's happening. And they have to estimate the size of the DIB and the number of companies affected and where the data is going. And they say that 485,589 contracts containing DFARS 7012 were awarded to 39,204 companies. 54% of all those contract awards went to 26,468 small businesses. We assume
wait.
Yeah. Way more than 12,000, by the way.
Yeah, so I was about to say, way more than the 12,000 that was estimated 5 years ago.
So we got a database all of a sudden, right? So DFARS Clause 7012 is the one that says if you have CUI, you have to implement 801.71. And if you put CUI in the cloud, that system has to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent at a minimum. So 485,000 contracts have DFARS 7012 in it. And they went to 39,000 total awardees, and about half of those were small businesses. So they got the half right, but they missed it by like half. There's like almost 30,000 small businesses. So then they assume 1/3 of awardees need a basic self-assessment every year, which is about 13,000 companies. And this estimate does not address new entrants or awardees who discontinue doing business with DoD. Snapshot in time estimate based off of this database. And so we estimate 68% to be small businesses, which is roughly like 8,800 companies.
Okay.
So that was for the DoD assessment methodology estimate, right? They have a different estimate for CMMC, which doesn't really make any sense. They use a different database for estimating the CMMC side of the rule. And they take this estimate from sam.gov. The DoD assessment methodology one was done from what's known as electronic data access. But in sam.gov, they say the total number of unique prime contractors and subcontractors is 220,966, not 300,000. All they did was run around in 2020 and say 300,000, 300,000, 300,000. Apparently, it's 220,966, according to sam.gov. There's 212,000 prime contractors, meaning people who are registered for awards and have completed their DFARS reps and certs in the system. And they say there are 8,300 tier 1 subcontractors from yet another database, the Federal Procurement Data System. And there's a very interesting line in the 2020 rule, and they say DoD does not track unique subcontract awardees below tier 1 of the multi-tier supply chain. We estimate that 74% of the unique prime contractors and subcontractors are small businesses because their NAICS code that they entered into the database says we're a small business, which is like 160,000 companies. So if you think about what they're saying, right? There is still no citation for where the data is going, and the numbers are all over the place, right? They haven't estimated the number to be the same in any rule or via any database that they cite in the estimates that they do make, right? Mm-hmm. The key line here to me in 2020 is we do not track unique subcontract awards below tier 1 subcontractors of the multi-tier supply chain. When you compare that to what they said in 2016, right, we do not know and cannot accurately estimate who has data or when. The conclusion being, if you read the rules and the estimates, they don't know. They have no idea how many people have the data or where the data is going or what's going to need to happen. It seems to me like all of their estimates are consistently too low because they can only see their prime contract awardees and their tier 1 subcontract awardees. So everything that they're estimating with no idea of where the data is going to be that number at a minimum, right? They can't see beyond it. So all those estimates are too low. So then in February of last year, when the DoD CIO took over the CMMC program, Dave McEwen, the DoD CISO, gave a webinar, and he said, when we did the analysis, it looks like a universe of about 80,000 companies are going to fall into this bucket. Probably all of them will have to get a level 2 assessment. 80,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 or 200,000 or 300,000, right? The DoD doesn't know. They don't know where the data is going. They don't know how many companies have the data. And even if they wanted to find out, as they are obligated to do under analyses for rulemaking over the last several years, they don't have that information to make a guess. So all their estimates are going to be the minimum number of companies. So when they say 80,000, my gut says that it is at least 80,000 companies that need that information. But it's just one of those little details that's buried in the text of the rules that I find to be very interesting. But it's in like a couple hundred pages of rules where you got to go hunt and peck. But I think it's interesting that the DoD has admitted all the way back in 2016 that they have no idea how many companies there are that need to comply or where the data is going. They can only estimate at a minimum.
Yeah, it's well, you just see wild inconsistencies with what's happening here, and you are with what's being reported, and you kind of touched right or hit it right on the head with what's happening. Is that it's a safe estimation, right? We safely estimate that there's at least this many companies there. There could be more,
Yeah.
we're pretty sure there's not less, but this is where it's going to apply.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why the DFARS clauses have a flow down mechanism with them. And the flow down mechanisms in the DFARS clauses say that when you flow the data, the CUI, the covered defense information, the export controlled information, whatever it happens to be, when you flow that data down into your supply chain, this clause that obligates people to implement requirements to protect that data is supposed to go with it, because we don't know where it's going. That's your job. It's your supply chain. You're flowing the data. We don't even have a database that tells us what that is going to be. We can't estimate it. So that's what that flow down mechanism is supposed to do.
Doesn't that, like, I don't want to say surprise you, because I'm not surprised by anything, much of anything anymore. But isn't that one of those things that you're just like, wait a minute, you don't have a way of tracking exactly how many people are involved in this whole process? You know what I mean?
They don't know. Well, I mean, imagine this, for the average business that's dealing with these requirements, right? The requirements, the scope of your environment is a function of your data flow. And one of the biggest challenges that organizations have is figuring out where their data flow is inside of the four walls of their business.
Makes
now
sense.
You're asking an organization the size of the DoD to know where their data is flowing in every tier of their entire supply chain. Maybe not an impossible task, but it's very difficult to do for a single company, probably exquisitely difficult to do for an organization like the DoD. That's why the flow down mechanisms exist. I just think that it's very interesting to see it in black and white in official DoD policy, where multiple times over the years they have crazy estimates that vary all over the place. And they finally admit we have no real idea, which when we get this rule, hopefully in May, when it gets published, there will be estimates about the size of the DIB. And I wonder if they will be the same as they were in 2020 or if they will be different. But they come with a big old honking grain of salt, because we just don't know.
Yeah. So what do you feel is right now, final answer, an accurate estimation of what's out there in the DIB? Like, how many organizations encompass the DIB?
Man,
are you going to do a lowball guess, like 220,000? That's the last thing that was definitive.
80,000. Yeah, 80,000. I would say that my estimate. Can I give a range, or do I have to give a number?
No, give a range. Give a range.
Okay, my range is 80,000 to 220,000 companies.
That's a good guess.
That's my range. Because I don't. Guess. Now, here's the caveat, though, is that's only the number of 220,000 is only the number of companies that DoD can see that they've given awards to, or that have expressed interest in receiving awards. As we know, as a managed service provider, there are many entities that receive and deal with interfacing to contractors and subcontractors, or directly in the path of CUI data flow that are not DoD contractors and subcontractors. And they have no intention of being contractors and subcontractors, right? So they're not in that number at all.
Yep.
So I would say 80 to 220,000 plus is my guess.
It's a good guess.
But it's one of those things where it's funny, because then that calls into question when you estimate the cost of the program, when you estimate the bureaucratic cost of the program overall, you're doing it on estimates that you don't have confidence in, right? And when you're waiting on the rule, if you're expecting the rule to come out in 2023 and like there's going to be some big revelation that we think that it's going to cost too much and that they're not going to do it, they don't even know what the answer is. So you take it with a grain of salt, right? Take it all with a grain of salt, because all these analyses, remember, it goes to the Office of Management and Budget for regulatory review. So everything that's in the rule is already written by the time it goes to their review. The text of the rule is done, right? It's not like they send it to OMB and then they're going to like keep writing more stuff in the rule. It gets published in the Federal Register afterward. So they've done their estimates. They've done their cost estimates. They've done their impact analyses. They've done all these things that they've sent up to OMB, and OMB has been like, looks right to me. Go ahead and publish it, right? So it is interesting because it becomes real policy. It is real codified black and white government policy, but it's also kind of a sham, right? Because they don't really know for sure. Nobody does, which is why it's a dangerous game. If you are below tier 1 of the DoD's data flow supply chain, they don't know that you exist. So they're probably not estimating impacts for you, right? Especially if you're on the other side of major prime contractors, if you're a supplier to the Boeings and the Lockheeds and the Raytheons of the world, DoD is not estimating their impacts and costs on you. They're estimating their impacts and costs on them, which they are not as big of a deal to those guys because they're way bigger. So there's some perspective here in terms of who they're talking to in the rules when they're making these estimates and how good the data is when they make those estimates that I think people maybe sometimes miss when they expect the rules to give everybody all the answers.
So I think one of the things that we've that's been tossed around a lot in conversations that we've definitely been a part of when it comes to this particular topic is that the DoD is more concerned about what's happening with the primes, and then the primes should be more concerned about what's happening with their supply chain, right? And it's basically allowing the primes to police their supply chain, to distribute the information to how they see fit, and to make sure that everything's in check there to protect their best business interests, obviously, to keep the supply chain intact and to continue to deliver. And it just seems like that's what it is. It's like a hierarchical. Did I say that right? Hierarchy. It's essentially a hierarchy of. Yeah. We'll go with hierarchy here. I'm no certified graphologist or anything, but we'll go with we'll go with hierarchy here, and that's what it is. The hierarchy or the chain of command is that the DoD wants to hear reports from tier 1s and the primes to make sure that
they're the only ones that they have privity of contract with. Their contract is with their direct contractors. If you're not on contract with the DoD and you're on contract with a prime, then that's a problem between you and the primes. And so that's why a lot of times when the DoD is talking about we met with industry and we got comments from industry, they're not talking to you. They're talking to Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop and all these guys who are mega prime contractors. And they look at it with their budgets and like their teams and their armies of compliance and cybersecurity people. And they go, yeah, well, okay. Like that's not a big deal. Like we can deal with that. And then when small businesses who they can't even see in the system, who have this data downstream, walk up and say, what about me? They go, that's between you and your prime contractor. That's not, the rule isn't even really for you. The rule is for the people that we contract with. So there's, right at the end of the year, I made one of those pointing Spider-Man memes where it feels like everybody is Spider-Man pointing at another Spider-Man, right? Like NIST is pointing at DoD and DoD is pointing at OMB and big businesses are pointing at small businesses. And then the cyber AB is, and everybody's just pointing, right? So the rules are the big, like when those are the events where the other shoe drops, right? And it's only happened a few times over the years. We're waiting on the one in 2023, but it will probably simultaneously upset and disappoint people when it comes out with what the estimates say, how good the estimates even are, and the fact that by the time it's published, it's already gone through all the regulatory review. It's already gone through all the checks and balances. It's already gone through all of the internal coordination. It's already the end result of years of red tape and bureaucracy and checks and analysis and this and that. And you have 60 days to submit a comment, and then they have to respond to it. So very little leverage over the rulemaking process by the time public comments actually come out. So, people should keep that in mind. It's another one of the reasons why when they debate about interim, final versus proposed, you're like, how much value are you going to get out of public comments to begin with? Do you expect a significant deviation in the quality of comments that you're going to get on this rule versus the 3 that you've done before? Because the 3 that you've done before have been pretty similar. We've already addressed those issues 3 times now. Is it worth delaying the program for a year in order to take the comments? And so That's not a non-issue when it comes to what the ultimate disposition of the rule will be, which is why when you see a headline that says CMMC is delayed or is likely to be delayed, you're like, based on what? Like, based on what? We have no idea if that's true. But, I think maybe just to get to our last topic here, we were talking about the basis for interim final rules previously as being something that stems from a national security basis. And the reason why there was a rule in 2020 that established the DODAM and the CMMC assessment methodologies based on national security was evidence that people hadn't implemented their requirements. And the jump that said, if you haven't implemented the requirements and we're losing data, we have to try to get you to implement the requirements to hopefully try and stem the loss of data to some degree. And at the end of last year, Merrill Research released another industry analysis in a long line of industry analyses going back many years at this point that analyzed the implementation rates of 800.171 requirements. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, the numbers are almost identical as they have been over the years about which controls are not implemented, the rates at which they're not implemented. I mean, you can look at the IG report before the CMMC rule. You can look at the DIBCAC numbers that we talked about in an earlier episode at the end of last year. You can look at Sarah Brin reports. You can look at MITRE reports. You can look at this report from Merrill Research. The requirements are not getting implemented for whatever reason. And so that was the basis for the 2020 rule. So when the 2023 rule comes up and they look around and they go, has anything improved since the 2020 rule? Are we okay taking a year to take public comment, or do we need to go now? And if you read the most recent industry analysis from Merrill Research, we should go now.
No, I agree. So the crazy thing about this this report, right, is that it's similar to the DIBCAC assessment. We covered it a couple episodes back. The results of the DIBCAC assessment, you see similarities in the controls, but what you do have in this report that is not offered in DIBCAC, and what everybody asked for when we started talking about the DIBCAC results, was demographics, right? Like a sampling size, what it was made up of, who reported, who did this, who did that. And so like, I just see like now more insight as to what's going on, as to, how things are playing out. The revenue interest definitely brought it up. Only 35% of the people have greater than $1 million worth of revenue coming in. That's significantly important considering the cost that's associated with taking on this process.
Sure, of course. Well, I mean, according to DoD estimates, the majority of the industrial base are small businesses. So it would make sense that the majority of people, we don't know the exact number, but the majority of people have lower revenues than higher revenues. And then when you look at a report like this that breaks it out like that, implementation rates are the worst for people who have the lowest revenue, which is understandable. They have fewer resources. But the tension here is that if the implementation rates remain low, then you're more likely to have an interim rule than a proposed rule, right? Mm-hmm. If you get a proposed rule and implementation rates are low, that doesn't mean the rule isn't happening, right? There's other reasons why they decided to do it. But you can't. Now, what I would say is CMMC would be on much shakier ground if reports like this and numbers from DIBCAC were the opposite. If you saw a significant trend up of the number of implemented requirements, if you saw better scores, if you saw the numbers changing, then the need for CMMC and external assurance is not as strong, right? Because things have changed. So you go proposed rule, or maybe you don't need it at all, right? But that is not what we have seen. So whenever somebody's like, hey, it's delayed, you're like, first of all, what does that mean in the context of how rulemaking works? I don't know what you're talking about. Second of all, do you think it's delayed because things are getting better? Or do you think it might be for another reason?
Yeah, like It's troubling. Like when you read reports like this, it's troubling to see the response that's taking place with regards to implementation of the practices and what's at stake when it comes to it. And it's that old beaten into the ground conversation that we have: national security, protect the warfighter, everything. That's very, very important to this, right? And what you see in two separate occasions, that the response is nowhere near what we want it to be, right? Yeah. And even more troubling is that in the Merrill research report, they analyzed or they asked essentially technology implementations that these organizations have in place. They're asking the IT heads, they're asking the CEOs, they're asking the people that are accountable, responsible for all of this stuff. And the highest percentage of implementations for a technology out of the different categories was DLP, which is great. Excellent, especially for a confidentiality-based model like CMMC. Yeah. But it was only at 33%.
Not a good number.
1 in 5 of the people that were surveyed had MFA in place.
1 in 5 have MFA, which, by the way, MFA, 5-point control, don't have it implemented, not POA&M'd, to get back to the question that we kicked off with. So 4 out of 5 companies are non-starters already, just based off that answer. So, to your question, is an interim rule better than a proposed rule? It's worse for 4 out of 5 companies, but how crazy is it at this point to ask for MFA? I mean, it is literally the first thing that's listed, no matter what model you look at, no matter what framework you look at, no matter what threat report comes out, it's always MFA. Quiz time.
What year did the first advisement, that's what we'll call it, the first advisement for people to implement MFA as a high priority implementation, in what year did that first get delivered from CISA? In what year was that first mentioned from CISA?
2016.
I'll give you 2 guesses.
2017.
2004.
Okay. Wait, really? Do we have a link to that? We should put that in the notes because it's 2004.
Yeah. So the first time I went down a nerd hole. So you went down a nerd hole during your Christmas break.
Yeah,
I did too. I went all the way back to CISA threat intelligence, all the way back to 2004, just to analyze
2004.
it. Right? 2004 is the first time that.
Let's say if we get an interim rule by 2024, we'll be in the middle of the rollout. If we get a proposed rule, we'll be starting the rollout. Let's just use 2024 as a baseline. 20 years after the first time that MFA was recommended as a high priority control, we will be on our way for one government agency.
1 in 5 of us will be on our way.
But I'm saying, like, as a rule, as a whole, we will be on our way to a single agency, the DoD, having an external assessment program to go get people to verify that they have implemented MFA.
Correct.
Among other requirements. That's crazy, man. I did not know 2004. I picked 2016 because it feels like everything happened in 2016, right? Like, it feels like everything in DoD land, cybersecurity, stems back to 2016. But 2004 is a crazy number. We should definitely link to that. All right. Before we get out of here, we're talking about predictions and wish lists for 2023. Here we go. Right? We're gonna have this clipped in 12 months for how accurate our predictions and or wishes were. You want to start?
Yeah, you want to alternate, or do you just want to nail them out? How many you want to do? How you want to do this?
I got one big one. Is 2 big ones on my list.
Okay. My bold prediction for 2023 is that the framework attached to CMMC, when it finally finalizes, will be NIST Rev 3, NIST 800-171 Rev 3.
Okay.
So when we finally get a final rule, that by the time it's finalized, the cybersecurity framework that people are going to have to abide by or to implement requirements based off of is NIST 800-171 Rev 3. Yep.
Okay.
Which will be more costly.
I think that I could definitely see that happening. So my prediction / wishes are 2 things related, right? One is we will see a published rule in May, June of this year. Right?
That's good. That's bold prediction.
Whether it is interim or proposed, I think it will be published by May or June. The reason why I say that, we'll link to a slide that I posted on LinkedIn the other day. It shows that of the twice annual estimations that the DoD makes, the window of time for how long in the future they think they will publish is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. At the end of 2021, they thought it wouldn't be for over 13 months. In the spring of last year, they said maybe 9 months. In the fall of last year, they said 5 months. And so it's all kind of converging on that March, May-ish timeline. So I'm going to say we will have a published rule May, June of this year. The second one, I think that before the end of the year, we will have a final version of 800-171 Rev 3. I think it will be out for initial public draft in late spring, and I think they will be able to finish and publish the official revision 3 by the end of the year, which, to go along with your prediction, fits in well with getting into the stream of events for needing to wrestle with Rev 3 when we get a final version of the CMMC rule. So we will revisit those predictions when relevant, at least by the end of the year, and then we'll see how accurate we were.
I got one more
mid-year review, depending on how things go. We'll see.
We will be at 65 authorized C3POs by this time next year.
Okay. All right. What are we at right now?
27 was the last official delivery.
We should plot this out, because we should plot out over time, what it did. And then 65 by January of 2024.
Yep. So
okay.
I mean, technically, based off of the news that we've got since the last time that we've heard from the AB with regards to how many are authorized, right? I can count at least a handful. So that puts us at 32, because that was 27. At that time last year, at the end of the last year, we were at 6.
Oh, wow.
6.
Okay. Well, I mean, fun with extrapolation. So, okay. So, we'll see how good we were with those predictions. I think they could all easily happen for sure. So, all right, man. First podcast of the year. Wrapped up the end of last year. Talked about some stuff that happened in January. In a couple of weeks, we'll roll up any extra stuff that happened in January and keep going from there.
Yeah, it's a good episode. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah. See you guys.